Now let's take a look at detente, which basically covers the entire 1970s. Detente meaning a period of peace between two previously hostile parties. Simple reason this happened: it's a shared convenience between the two countries. Money. They'd been embroiled in an arms race ever since the end of World War II, and it's cost them a huge amount of money developing weapons which they can never ever use because of mutually assured destruction. They've developed the weapons so powerful that to use them would destroy each other, so they're just there as a deterrent and therefore can never ever be used. In addition to that, the countries start to face their own problems. So, in summary, both sides found it hard having to keep up in the arms race and needed more money to focus on domestic social issues. America needed a break, and the Soviet Union was in an even worse state. So for America, they'd become involved in the Vietnam War, massively expensive, huge loss of life for American soldiers, effectively a long drawn out conflict and an unwinnable war. In America, public opinion had turned against involvement in the Vietnam War. The people of America didn't want to be involved, which meant there were huge protests against American involvement in the war, the cost of it, and the fact that many young soldiers were being killed and civilians who were drafted into the conflict as well. In addition to that, America has its own domestic issues in terms of the civil rights movement. There's huge racial tensions in America. And how can America be seen to be a bastion of freedom in the world, a symbol of freedom in the world, when in its own country, black people didn't have equal rights? So effectively what the policy during detente is we need to get our own situation in order before we deal in international problems. From the Soviet Union's point of view, money needed to be invested to improve the standard of living in the Soviet Union. Very simply, they've spent loads and loads of money on nuclear weapons and weapons in general, desperately trying to keep up with America, and it's impacted on the quality of the standard of living in the Soviet Union. And remembering the whole Cold War is an argument over ideologies, and clearly the standard of life in the Soviet Union isn't as good. In summary, less money on weapons would be spent, and the fact that there are better relations between the countries, this meant it was a safe policy. So let's have a look at some examples of this more cooperative atmosphere and period of peace. What takes place during this time? Well, the first thing we've got is SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Now, this is talking about or dealing with effectively nuclear weapons. So, signed by Richard Nixon and Brezhnev. The basic principle of the agreement sets out rules surrounding conduct with nuclear weapons to avoid war. So this is both countries coming together and deciding, how do we avoid nuclear war? How do we limit our nuclear weapons? Well, what they say, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty stated that anti-ballistic missiles were only allowed at two sites. These are the missiles which would be shot up into the air to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles or surface-to-surface missiles. So anti-nuclear bomb sites were only allowed in two sites or at two sites. The treaty limited intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are the missiles which we've discussed, which could be launched from land to a target, to land or surface to surface, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and SLBMs. SLBMs are submarine nuclear weapons, which were obviously stealthy, not easy to trace, and obviously you don't know how many they've got because they're hidden. So the treaty aims to limit how many intercontinental ballistic missiles the countries could have and how many nuclear weapons they could have on submarines. The treaty, however, the weaknesses of it are that they did not cover new technology, such as the multiple re-entry nuclear weapons, which would, the ones we've seen, which would be one missile, which would then split into multiple different nuclear missiles to land. So the treaty doesn't limit how many of them you can have, but what it does demonstrate is hugely improved relations between the countries, and both sides eager to demonstrate this by visiting each other's country. There is also, they recognise that this treaty isn't perfect, so in the spirit of cooperation, they plan to meet again to established SALT II, which would build on these agreements. We'll discuss SALT II later on, but obviously it's never actually ratified or passed in Congress. The other limitation of the treaty is obviously the simple fact that in a massive crisis where tensions reach such a boiling point, it's unrealistic to expect the sides to adhere to what a piece of paper says. But once again, it does show the improved relations and the good intentions between the countries. Then we move on to the next event during detente, the Helsinki Accords. In 1975, this is the high point. This is the peak of detente. This is the best the relations between the countries get during the Cold War until the end of the Cold War. And this is the section of the course where the agreement is split into three baskets. So the first basket, you've got the European borders, which said that European borders could not be altered by force. This reaffirms the buffer zone that, going all the way back to the very, very start of the course that Stalin had wanted to set up at the end of World War II. This makes the Soviet Union very, very happy because this confirms the Iron Curtain and shows that that's their area of control now. Obviously, though, this abandons Hungary and Czechoslovakia to communist Soviet rule, so they're obviously not happy about it, but there's nothing they can do about it because they're under Soviet control. Brezhnev was obviously happy with the basket as it recognised the existing borders surrounding the satellite states. He's got that and it will not change. It's signed, it's dealt with, it's agreed. The second basket is the basket regarding international cooperation. It says we will work together. This can be shown or seen in the joint space mission between the countries, in which they send astronauts together in one mission into space. So again, it's that idea of international cooperation, good relations between the countries, good intentions. They also begin to trade together. Both sides were happy with this, and it shows the cooperative spirit and demonstrates the better terms that they were on during detente. The third basket is deals with human rights issues. This said that both countries would respect individual rights and freedoms such as religion, free speech, and free movement should be respected. Democracy should exist. Later on, we'll discuss it later, but this will open the door to the collapse of the Soviet Union later on. But for now, the Soviet Union is basically just going to ignore this. However, America would be happy with this basket as it has the potential to embarrass the Soviet Union, as will prove to be true when we get into the reign of Gorbachev later on. But for now, effectively, the Soviet Union signs this, agrees to it, but it's basically just going to ignore it. But again, it shows the good relations between the countries, although one of the reasons when we get to the end of detente why it will end is the fact that the Soviet Union do just ignore this basket is one of the reasons why later on America started to think, well, hang on a minute, we can't really trust the agreements that we're making with the Soviets. And that's when detente will end in 1979. So then you get to another agreement that was made but was never passed by Congress. So the two leaders of the countries make this agreement, but it never gets passed in Congress due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But what SALT II intended to do, they were very complex discussions between the countries because it's Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. We're talking about limiting nuclear weapons, so very complex discussions. It's a complex treaty signed by President Carter and Brezhnev, restricting missile launchers, strategic bombers, and bans on new intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're those multiple re-entry missiles. This improved relations began to fade as America didn't trust the Soviet Union. So we're getting towards the end of detente now, and as I mentioned earlier, the relations are starting to fade, basically because, for a number of reasons, but because the Soviet Union are just ignoring Basket 3, and you've also got the fact that America had been humiliated by the kidnapping in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution. And Tehran American embassy had been captured by Muslim fundamentalists, and this had made America seem weak. And American public opinion had changed now, where they believed they needed to reaffirm their strength. Basically, the Iranian embassy hostage situation wouldn't have happened to America 10 years ago when we were a powerhouse. So now that we get to 1979 and American diplomats are taken hostage, public opinion believes they need to reaffirm their strength on the world stage. So already this period of détente is ending in the mid-June 1979. Relations are starting to sour, and ultimately the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is what brings détente to an end.